On May 27, 1943, a B-24 Liberator bomber called Green Hornet took off from Funafuti in the Pacific for what should have been a routine search and rescue mission. The plane was searching for a lost aircraft that had gone down somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. But the Green Hornet itself was a troubled aircraft. It had mechanical problems. The crew knew it. They called it a lemon, a plane that should have been grounded for repairs. 11 men were aboard that day. Among them was a 26-year-old bombardier, First Lieutenant Louis Zamperini. Just 7 years earlier, Zamperini had been running in the Olympic Games in Berlin, competing before Adolf Hitler himself, setting records and being celebrated as one of America's great young athletes. Now he was flying missions over the Pacific, hunting Japanese targets, searching for lost comrades. The Green Hornet never completed its mission. About 850 miles into the flight, the left engine failed. Then the right engine sputtered and died. The plane, now powerless, plummeted toward the ocean. The pilot tried desperately to keep it level, to give the crew a chance. But there was no saving it. The B-24 hit the water at high speed and broke apart on impact. 8 men died instantly. Only 3 survived the crash. Louis Zamperini was one of them. He found himself tangled in a mess of wires underwater, the plane sinking rapidly beneath him. He struggled free, kicked toward the surface, gasped for air. Around him, wreckage floated. 2 life rafts had inflated automatically. And there were 2 other survivors. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Russell Allen Phillips, called Phil. And the tail gunner, Sergeant Francis McNamara, called Mac. 3 men. 2 small rubber rafts. No food except 2 chocolate bars. No water except what rainwater they could collect. No navigation equipment. No real idea where they were or which direction land might be. And they were 850 miles from where they'd taken off, adrift in the largest ocean on Earth. What followed was 47 days of the most extreme survival ordeal imaginable. 47 days of hunger, thirst, storms, sharks, and enemy attacks. 47 days that would test every limit of human endurance. And for Louis Zamperini, it was only the beginning. Because when those 47 days finally ended, he would find himself in a situation even worse than being lost at sea. This is the story of Louis Zamperini. Olympic athlete, bombardier, castaway, prisoner of war, and ultimately, a man who proved that the human spirit cannot be broken, no matter what hell it endures. Louis Sylvie Zamperini was born on January 26, 1917 in Olean, New York, to Italian immigrant parents, Anthony and Louise. He had an older brother Pete and 2 younger sisters. The family moved to Torrance, California when Louis was a child, seeking better opportunities in the sunshine of Southern California. But young Louis was trouble. He was small for his age, spoke broken English with an Italian accent, and got picked on constantly. He responded by becoming a fighter, a troublemaker, a delinquent. He started smoking at age 5, drinking at age 8. By the time he was a teenager, Louis was stealing, getting into fights, running from the police. His parents despaired. Teachers gave up on him. He seemed destined for prison or worse. Then his older brother Pete had an idea. Pete was on the track team at Torrance High School. He convinced Louis to try running. At first, Louis hated it. Running was hard. It hurt. Why would anyone voluntarily torture themselves like that? But Pete pushed him, challenged him, trained with him. And slowly, Louis discovered something remarkable. He was good at running. Really good. By his senior year of high school in 1934, Louis Zamperini set the national high school record for the mile. 4 minutes and 21.2 seconds. That record would stand for 20 years. Nobody could touch it. Louis went to the University of Southern California on a scholarship. He kept running, kept training, kept getting faster. In 1936, at just 19 years old, he qualified for the United States Olympic team. He would compete in the 5,000-meter race at the Berlin Olympics. The 1936 Berlin Olympics were a propaganda showcase for Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler wanted to demonstrate Aryan superiority to the world. American athletes like Jesse Owens would famously defy that narrative by winning multiple gold medals. Louis Zamperini didn't win a medal. He finished 8th in his race. But he did something that caught everyone's attention. On the final lap, Zamperini unleashed a finishing kick so fast it broke the Olympic record for the last lap. He ran that final circuit in 56 seconds, faster than anyone had ever run a final lap in Olympic history. The crowd went wild. Reporters dubbed him the boy with the fast finish. Even Hitler reportedly asked to meet him afterward, shaking his hand and saying a few words in German that Zamperini didn't understand. Louis returned to America as a celebrity athlete. He kept training, kept competing. Everyone expected him to medal at the 1940 Olympics in Tokyo. He was getting faster, approaching the 4-minute mile, a barrier that seemed almost superhuman at the time. His future was bright. The world was his. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. The 1940 Olympics had already been cancelled because of the war in Europe. Now there would be no Olympics for the foreseeable future. Louis Zamperini's athletic career was put on hold indefinitely. In November 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, Louis enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. He trained as a bombardier, learning to operate the Norden bomb sight, to calculate trajectories, to drop bombs with precision on enemy targets. By 1943, he was a first lieutenant, stationed in the Pacific, flying missions against Japanese positions. The work was dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire, fighter attacks, mechanical failures. Every mission could be your last. Louis's plane, which they'd named Superman, had been shot up badly on a raid over Nauru Island. The aircraft had been hit by more than 600 rounds of enemy fire. Somehow it made it back to base, but it was so badly damaged it was taken out of service for repairs. That's why Louis and his crew were assigned to fly the Green Hornet on May 27, 1943. Superman wasn't available. The Green Hornet was. And despite everyone knowing it was a problematic aircraft, orders were orders. They took off that morning not knowing they'd never return. When the plane crashed and Louis fought his way to the surface, his first thought was survival. Get to the rafts. Account for survivors. Take stock of what they had. The situation was grim. 3 men in 2 small rubber rafts, each about 6 feet long. Phil, the pilot, was injured but alive. Mac, the tail gunner, was in shock, terrified. They had the 2 chocolate bars, which they rationed carefully. They had a few tins that could hold water if it rained. They had fishing line and hooks. They had a flare gun with a few flares. And that was it. No radio. No way to signal for help except the flares, and those had to be saved for when they actually saw a plane or ship. The first few days were the worst. The sun was merciless, beating down on them, blistering their skin, cracking their lips. The rubber rafts absorbed heat and became almost too hot to touch. At night, it got cold, and they shivered with no blankets or protection. The ocean swelled beneath them, lifting them up and crashing them down, making them constantly seasick. Hunger gnawed at them. Thirst was worse. Their mouths dried out. Their throats felt like sandpaper. They caught rainwater when storms passed, but it was never enough. They tried to catch fish with the hooks and line, but the fish wouldn't bite. On the 5th day, Mac panicked. While the others slept, he ate both chocolate bars. Their entire food supply gone. When Louis and Phil woke up and discovered what Mac had done, they were furious. But what could they do? Mac was ashamed, terrified, losing hope. They had to keep him together, keep him from giving up completely. They developed a routine to maintain their sanity. They told stories, sharing memories of home, of family, of life before the war. They sang songs. They played mental games, challenging each other to remember details, to keep their minds sharp. Phil would describe meals his mother used to make, going into elaborate detail about every ingredient, every step of the cooking process. It was torture and comfort at the same time. Then the sharks came. The great predators of the Pacific, drawn by the presence of the rafts, circled constantly. They bumped the rafts from below, testing them, looking for weaknesses. Sometimes they'd breach the surface, their massive bodies thrashing, mouths full of teeth. The men fought them off with oars, hitting them, trying to drive them away. But the sharks were persistent, patient, always there. Birds occasionally landed on the rafts, exhausted from their own long flights over the ocean. When this happened, the The men would grab them bare-handed, kill them quickly, and eat them raw. Every scrap of meat, every organ, nothing was wasted. The taste was awful, but it kept them alive. They used pieces of bird as bait for fishing, and occasionally they caught something. On the 27th day, a Japanese bomber spotted them. The men, desperate for rescue, waved and shouted. Then the plane opened fire. Machine gun bullets tore through the water, stitched lines across the surface, punctured the rafts. The men dove into the water, hiding beneath the rafts as the plane made pass after pass, trying to kill them. When the plane finally left, they examined the damage. The rafts were riddled with holes, slowly deflating. They had a patch kit and worked frantically to seal every puncture, to keep the rafts functional. It took hours, and they knew now that they were in enemy-controlled waters. Any plane that spotted them might try to kill them rather than rescue them. Mac, the tail gunner, had never recovered from eating the chocolate bars. The guilt, the fear, the starvation, it all combined to break him down. He grew weaker each day, his body consuming itself. On the 33rd day adrift, Mac died. His body had simply given out. There was nothing Louis and Phil could do. They said a prayer over Mac's body. They'd been with him for 33 days, sharing that tiny raft, fighting to survive together. Now he was gone. They wrapped him as best they could and pushed his body over the side, committing him to the ocean. Then there were two. Louis and Phil drifted on. By now they'd lost massive amounts of weight. Louis, who'd been a fit athlete at around 160 pounds, was down to about 80 pounds. Phil was similarly emaciated. Their bodies were skeletal, their faces gaunt. Every movement took enormous effort. They were dying slowly, wasting away. But they didn't give up. They kept catching rainwater, kept fishing, kept singing songs and telling stories and refusing to accept that this was how they'd die. On the 47th day, after drifting nearly 2,000 miles across the Pacific, they saw land. The Marshall Islands. They'd made it. But the Marshall Islands were occupied by Japanese forces. As the rafts washed ashore, Japanese sailors were waiting. Louis and Phil were too weak to resist. They were pulled from the rafts, barely conscious, more dead than alive. They'd survived 47 days at sea. And now they were prisoners of war. If Louis and Phil thought their ordeal was over, they were tragically mistaken. What came next would be worse than the ocean, worse than the sharks and the starvation and the 47 days of sun and thirst. What came next would be 2 years of systematic brutality designed to break them completely. The Japanese took them to Kwajalein Atoll, a place the American prisoners would come to call Execution Island. It was an interrogation center where prisoners were questioned, tortured, and often executed. Louis and Phil, barely alive when they arrived, were given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them from dying immediately. They were kept in a small cell, given filthy water to drink, rice crawling with maggots to eat. Interrogators demanded information about American military operations. When Louis refused to talk, they beat him. When Phil refused, they beat him. The beatings were methodical, designed to inflict maximum pain without killing them outright. For 6 weeks they remained at Kwajalein, growing slightly stronger from the meager food but suffering daily abuse. Then they were transferred to Ofuna, a secret interrogation camp near Yokohama. Ofuna was different from regular POW camps. The prisoners there weren't officially registered. According to the Geneva Conventions, the Red Cross should have been notified of their capture. But Japan didn't register the men at Ofuna. Officially, they didn't exist. This meant they had no protections, no oversight. No one in the outside world knew they were alive. Louis's family had already received a telegram declaring him missing and presumed dead. They'd held a funeral service. As far as everyone back home knew, Louis Zamperini had died when the Green Hornet went down. At Ofuna, the prisoners were kept in individual cells, given barely enough food to survive, and subjected to constant psychological torture. Guards would beat prisoners for the smallest infractions, or for no reason at all. The goal was to break their spirit, to make them compliant, to extract information. Louis was recognized by some of the guards as the Olympic athlete. This made him a target. The Japanese saw him as a propaganda opportunity. They wanted to make an example of him, to show that even America's heroes could be broken. Louis refused. No matter how much they beat him, no matter how they humiliated him, he wouldn't cooperate with their propaganda efforts. After over a year at Ofuna, Louis was transferred to Omori, a POW camp outside Tokyo. And that's where he met the man who would haunt his nightmares for decades. Corporal Matsuhiro Watanabe. The prisoners called him the Bird. The Bird was a monster. There's no other word for it. He was a sadistic psychopath who took pleasure in tormenting prisoners. He had a special hatred for Louis, the famous Olympian, the man who'd run in Berlin, who'd survived 47 days at sea. The Bird made Louis his #1 prisoner, singling him out for the worst treatment. The beatings were daily. Sometimes the Bird would beat Louis with his fists. Sometimes with a belt. Sometimes with a bamboo stick or a wooden club. He'd force Louis to hold heavy wooden beams above his head for hours. If Louis's arms dropped from exhaustion, the Bird would beat him and make him start over. The Bird would make Louis clean the camp latrines with his bare hands. He'd force him to dance for the guards' entertainment. He'd humiliate him in front of other prisoners, trying to destroy his dignity, trying to make him beg, trying to break him. But Louis wouldn't break. He couldn't explain why. Something inside him, some core of defiance, refused to give the Bird the satisfaction. Every time he got knocked down, he got back up. Every time the Bird tried a new form of torture, Louis endured it. The other prisoners watched in awe and horror. They saw what the Bird was doing to Louis, and they knew any one of them could be next. But they also drew strength from Louis's refusal to submit. If he could endure, maybe they could too. In March 1945, as American bombers began hitting Tokyo regularly, Louis was transferred again, this time to Naoetsu, a camp in northern Japan near a coal factory. The Bird was transferred there too. He wasn't done with Louis yet. The winter of 1944 and 1945 was brutal. The prisoners at Naoetsu worked in the coal factory in freezing conditions, malnourished, sick, dying from cold and disease and starvation. Over a third of all Allied prisoners in Japanese camps died. The Japanese High Command had plans to execute all remaining POWs if Japan faced invasion. Louis worked in the factory, shoveling coal, his body skeletal, his strength nearly gone. At night he slept on wooden platforms with no heat, no blankets. Men died around him regularly. But he kept surviving, day after day, week after week. The Bird continued his campaign of terror. He seemed obsessed with breaking Louis. It had become personal for him. Why wouldn't this American submit? Why wouldn't he beg? The Bird increased the severity of the beatings, inventing new tortures, trying everything to make Louis break. Then on August 6, 1945, something changed. The guards became agitated, nervous. Word spread through the camp that something significant had happened, though the prisoners weren't told what. Unknown to them, the United States had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15, the guards suddenly left. The camp was abandoned. The prisoners, confused and suspicious, stayed put, afraid it might be a trick. Then on August 22, American B-29 bombers flew over the camp at low altitude. The prisoners could see the crews waving. The planes dropped supplies by parachute. Food, medicine, clothing. The prisoners realized it was over. The war had ended. They were free. Men wept. They embraced each other. They were going home. Louis Zamperini had survived. Against all odds, through 47 days at sea and 2 years of hell in Japanese prison camps, through starvation and beatings and torture, he'd survived. He'd been declared dead by the War Department. His family had mourned him. But he was alive. When Louis finally returned home in October 1945, he was a hero. The newspapers ran stories about the Olympic athlete who'd survived 47 days adrift and 2 years as a POW. He was invited to speak at events. People wanted to hear his story. He married a beautiful woman named Cynthia Applewhite in 1946. From the outside, it looked like Louis Zamperini was living a happy ending. But inside, Louis was broken. The war had ended, but the battles in his mind hadn't. Every night he had nightmares about the Bird. He'd wake up screaming, reliving the beatings, feeling the bamboo stick across his back, seeing that sadistic face. He couldn't escape it. Louis started drinking to numb the pain. He drank heavily, daily, trying to drown the memories. His marriage suffered. Cynthia wanted to leave him. He was angry all the time, violent in his outbursts, unable to control his rage. The PTSD, though they didn't call it that then, was destroying him. He became obsessed with going back to Japan and killing the bird. He'd plan it out in detail, imagining finding Watanabe and strangling him with his bare hands. The fantasy consumed him. He drank more, spiraled deeper into darkness. In 1949, Cynthia convinced Louis to attend a Billy Graham evangelistic crusade in Los Angeles. Graham was a young preacher who was becoming famous for his revival meetings, and Cynthia thought maybe, just maybe, it might help. Louis didn't want to go. He went anyway to keep the peace. At that crusade, something happened to Louis that he couldn't fully explain. He heard Graham talking about suffering, about pain, about forgiveness. And something broke open inside him. All the rage, all the hatred, all the darkness he'd been carrying for years, it all came pouring out. Louis gave his life to Christ that night. He went home, poured all his alcohol down the drain, and never drank again. The nightmares about the bird stopped. The rage dissipated. For the first time since the war, Louis felt peace. But the most remarkable thing was what Louis did next. He decided to forgive. To truly, completely forgive the men who'd tortured him. In 1950, Louis traveled back to Japan. He visited Sugamo prison where many of his former captors were being held for war crimes. He met with guards who'd beaten him, who'd humiliated him, who'd tried to break him. And he told them he forgave them. The prisoners were stunned. Why would this American come back to tell them he forgave them? Louis explained that he'd been consumed by hatred, that it had nearly destroyed him, and that forgiveness had set him free. He wanted them to know that freedom too. Louis tried to meet with the bird, Matsuhiro Watanabe. But Watanabe, who'd been listed as number 23 on General MacArthur's list of the 40 most wanted war criminals in Japan, had gone into hiding. He'd evaded capture after the war, and he refused to meet with Louis. Watanabe would live in hiding for years, eventually emerging in the 1990s but still refusing to meet Louis or apologize for what he'd done. Louis didn't let that stop him. He couldn't control Watanabe's choices, but he could control his own. He dedicated the rest of his life to helping others. He founded Victory Boys Camp, a camp for troubled youth, giving young men a chance to turn their lives around the way running had given him a chance decades earlier. He became an inspirational speaker, traveling across the country sharing his story. He talked about survival, about resilience, about the power of forgiveness. He wrote 2 autobiographies, both titled Devil at My Heels, published in 1956 and 2003. His message was simple but profound. No matter what you've been through, no matter how broken you are, you can find redemption. You can heal. You are unbroken. In 1998, at age 81, Louis returned to Japan one more time. He was given the honor of carrying the Olympic torch in Nagano before the Winter Olympic Games. He ran through the streets holding that torch, the same streets where he'd once been imprisoned, where he'd suffered so much. But now he was free, truly free, running not away from his past but in triumph over it. Louis lived to be 97 years old. He died on July 2, 2014, after a long battle with pneumonia. By then, his story had reached millions through Laura Hillenbrand's best-selling book Unbroken, a World War II story of survival, resilience, and redemption, published in 2010. The book was a massive success, staying on the New York Times bestseller list for over 4 years. In 2014, just months before Louis died, Angelina Jolie directed a film adaptation of Unbroken, starring Jack O'Connell as Louis. The movie brought his story to an even wider audience. A sequel, Unbroken Path to Redemption, was released in 2018, focusing on Louis's post-war struggles and his journey to faith and forgiveness. When Louis died, tributes poured in from around the world. The University of Southern California, where he'd run track, dedicated the Louis Zamperini Plaza in his honor. Torrance High School, where his running career began, named a stadium after him. The city airport in Torrance was renamed Zamperini Field. President Barack Obama released a statement praising Louis as an American hero. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the men who'd known him during the war, fellow POWs who'd watched him endure the bird's torture and refused to break. They called him the bravest man they'd ever known. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was terrified and kept going anyway. The story of Louis Zamperini is almost too incredible to believe. An Olympic athlete turned bombardier. A plane crash survivor who drifted for 47 days in the Pacific. A POW who endured 2 years of systematic torture. A broken veteran who found redemption through faith and forgiveness. A man who lived to 97 and spent his final decades helping others find hope. Every part of his story challenges us. How would we respond to 47 days adrift at sea? Would we maintain hope or give in to despair? How would we handle 2 years of torture at the hands of a sadistic guard? Would we find the strength to endure or would we break? And perhaps most challenging of all, could we forgive? After everything Louis suffered, after the beatings and humiliation and years of nightmares, he chose to forgive. Not because his tormentors deserved it. They didn't. But because holding on to hatred was destroying him, and forgiveness set him free. Louis Zamperini's life proves that the human spirit is truly unbreakable. We can endure far more than we think possible. We can survive circumstances that seem impossible. We can overcome trauma that would crush most people. And we can choose, even after the worst experiences imaginable, to forgive, to heal, to move forward. The boy who was a troublemaker in Torrance became an Olympic athlete. The athlete became a bombardier. The bombardier became a castaway. The castaway became a POW. The POW became a broken veteran. And the broken veteran became an inspiration to millions. Louis Zamperini's legacy is not just about survival. It's about what comes after survival. It's about choosing hope over despair, forgiveness over hatred, purpose over bitterness. It's about being tested to the absolute limit and discovering that you're stronger than you knew. When Laura Hillenbrand titled her book Unbroken, she captured the essence of Louis Zamperini's life. He was beaten, starved, tortured, broken down in every way imaginable. But his spirit, that core of who he was, remained unbroken. They couldn't break him in 47 days at sea. They couldn't break him in 2 years of prison camps. They couldn't break him even after the war when PTSD and alcoholism nearly destroyed him. In the end, Louis Zamperini won. Not because he survived, though that itself is remarkable. He won because he chose to live fully, to forgive completely, to inspire others, to make his suffering mean something by helping those who were suffering too. The teenage troublemaker from Torrance lived 97 years. He competed in the Olympics, fought in World War II, survived the impossible, overcame his demons, and spent half a century sharing a message of hope with anyone who would listen. His life spanned nearly a century, touching millions of people, proving that one person's courage and resilience can inspire the world. Louis Zamperini was, in every sense, unbroken. And his story will never be forgotten.